She let us in. She let the photographer take the picture. She said her name and her age and where she had grown up and what kind of patients she worked with. We were walking out when she changed her mind. In the corridor with the door of the ward still half open behind her, she stopped and asked us please not to print it. Her husband read this magazine, she said. He did not know what patients she worked with. We stood in the corridor for a minute. She was not crying. She was calm. She said it the way people say practical things, the way they tell you which train to take. She had let us photograph her because she had been told we were doing a piece on the city's fight against the new disease, and she was proud of her work. She had not thought, at the moment she agreed, about the husband at home, at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, turning the pages. I told her we would not use the picture. The photographer took the cassette out and handed it to her. She turned it over in her hand for a second and put it in the pocket of her coat. She thanked us. She went back into the ward. I smoked outside the hospital before I went to the office. There was a bench by a side entrance where doctors came out between rounds. A nurse in a white cap came out and lit a cigarette with a match from a book that had the name of a restaurant printed on it. She did not know me. She looked at me. I said hello. She said hello. Neither of us said anything else. I thought about what the nurse who had changed her mind had said. I thought about the husband in the kitchen with his coffee. I thought about the fact that she worked at Infectious Hospital No. 2, which the whole city knew. She had told him, presumably, that she worked in a regular infectious ward. Hepatitis, measles. Whatever a person could sustain across a breakfast table for years. I went back to the office. I put the cassette on a shelf, and I did not touch it again. 2 days later, I was reading a translated piece in a foreign bulletin the office subscribed to. It was by an American doctor, Jonathan Mann. He had, until recently, directed the global program on the new disease at the World Health Organization in Geneva, and he had resigned that year because of what he called disagreements about priorities. He was writing independently now. His most recent piece contained a phrase that had begun to travel through the magazines that published on this beat. He called it the third epidemic. There were, he said, 3 epidemics, one inside the other. The first was the epidemic of the virus itself. It had begun in the 1970s, and nobody at the time had noticed it, because the virus had done nothing visible yet. It had only moved. It had moved through populations, across borders, across continents, for years before anyone had a name for it. That was the silent epidemic, the first. The second was the epidemic of the disease. That one had begun in 1981, when doctors in the United States had realized that certain young men were dying of illnesses that should not have killed them. That was the moment the virus stopped being invisible. That was the moment it became something a newspaper could write about. The third epidemic was different. The third was not the virus, and it was not the disease. The third was what the first 2 did to the people around them. The fear, the blame, the search for someone to hold responsible. The expulsion of the sick from their jobs and their apartments and their families and their countries. The punishment of the uninfected for being suspected of being infected. The reasons people stopped answering the phone. Mann had written that the third epidemic was, in its way, more dangerous than the first 2, because the virus, he said, could be studied. The disease could be treated. But the third epidemic was made out of our own minds, and what our own minds did to other people. And there was no laboratory for that. There was no vaccine. There was only the slow, stubborn work of not turning away. I read the piece twice. I put it down. I thought about the nurse in the corridor. I thought I understood, better than I had 2 days ago, what I had just watched. I wrote down, over the next few weeks, the cases I could find in my own city. A student at a technical institute in the capital. A young woman. She had tested positive during a routine screening, and somehow the result had traveled through the dean's offices faster than a letter traveled inside our postal system. She was expelled. Her dormitory was told that she was to leave by the end of the week. She left, she had nowhere to go, so she went home to her parents in a provincial city, where people had already heard about it from a cousin who worked in the dean's office. She did not stay there long either. I do not know where she is now. A mother of a small girl. Her daughter had been infected in a hospital as an infant, one of the syringe cases, of which there had been a number by that year. After the local paper ran the story, the family began to receive telephone calls. The calls always came at night. The same voice, in different words, would say that if the family did not leave the city, the child would be killed. The mother eventually began disconnecting the telephone at 9 in the evening and reconnecting it at 7 in the morning. She continued to go to her factory during the day. The child was cared for by a grandmother. The mother said she was not afraid for herself. She said she was afraid for the child, and she was afraid of what the calls would do to the grandmother, who had a heart condition. A patient in the ward I had visited, a man in his 40s, construction worker who had been hospitalized 6 months earlier. The ward was not pleasant. It was not clean. The food was cafeteria food, and the sheets were gray. The patient had lost 12 kilograms since his admission. He had recently been told he could go home. He had refused. The ward was unpleasant, but the ward was not his apartment. At his apartment, he said, his wife had begun cleaning everything with bleach after he touched it. He had walked past his son in the corridor, and the son had flattened himself against the wall to avoid him. He had rather stay in the ward where nobody touched him than go home where everyone who touched him had begun to flinch. He said this as if he were explaining a small problem at work. I thought about writing the 3 cases up as a piece. I thought about the problem of doing so. I could not name the student. I could not name the mother. I could not name the construction worker. I could not name the institute or the factory or the apartment building. Each of them had insisted that I not use their real details, for reasons that did not require me to ask why. I ended up with 3 pieces of reporting, in which the central facts were all present, and none of the nouns could be used. I thought about publishing it anyway with invented names. I thought about how that would look to the mother reading it, if it reached her, seeing herself under another name. I did not publish it. I kept the notes. A colleague brought me around this time a translated magazine piece from California. It was about a man named Michael Reynolds. Reynolds was the director of a community center in a neighborhood of Los Angeles called West Hollywood. The center, which he had helped found, served the gay and lesbian population of the neighborhood. It offered classes, support groups, legal aid, a food pantry, and 2 small rooms upstairs where, for a few months at a time, people with nowhere else to go could sleep. The center was open every day of the week, and Reynolds, according to the piece, was there for most of every day. He had been diagnosed in the middle of the decade. He had been one of the first men in his circle of friends to test positive. Nobody at that point really knew what the diagnosis meant. He had been given a range of possibilities, most of them short. The doctors had quietly told him to put his affairs in order. His friends, in the period after the diagnosis, had mostly drifted away. Not all at once. One at a time, a phone call not returned, an invitation not extended, a lunch canceled and not rescheduled. After a year, he had mostly stopped hearing from the people who had been at his birthday party the year before the diagnosis. He had not, he said, been angry about it. He had been tired. His mother stopped answering his calls. She lived in a small town in a state east of California. She had raised him and his brother alone. He had always called her on Sundays. After he told her about the diagnosis, the Sunday calls had gotten shorter. She had begun to be busy on Sundays. She had begun to say she had to go. Then eventually, she did not pick up the phone. He tried calling for about 4 months. Then he stopped trying. The community center had been what held him up. He did not mean this metaphorically. The center had bought his medication. His medication cost about $8,000 a year at the time, which he could not possibly pay. The center had raised the money. They had paid his rent for 2 months when he had been too weak to work, and they had, on one occasion, sent 2 members to drive him to the hospital when he collapsed at home, because the ambulance crews in parts of the city had begun, quietly, to refuse those calls. The doctors had given him 18 months. At the time the piece was written, he had been alive for 4 years. He was, by the account of the journalist who interviewed him, in reasonably good health. He had started lifting weights as part of a physical regimen his doctor had suggested, and he had gotten so consistent about it that he now had the shoulders of a man who lifted things for a living. He was active in the anti-AIDS campaign in his neighborhood. He gave speeches. He had testified before a committee of the state legislature. He was, the journalist wrote, one of the most alive people the journalist had ever met. He had not spoken to his mother in 3 years. I read that last line 3 times. I thought about my nurse in the corridor. I thought about the mother with the disconnected phone. I thought about the construction worker staying in the ward. I thought about who disappears when the diagnosis comes and in what order. It was not the stranger who disappeared first. It was not the neighbor. It was not the coworker. It was the ones closest in. That was the geometry the third epidemic made. The closer someone was to you before, the faster they went. The furthest away, the last to leave, were strangers. Strangers sometimes did not leave at all. Strangers sometimes turned out, through some mercy of the system, to be the people who stayed. In Reynolds's case, the strangers were the community center. Men and women he had mostly met after his diagnosis, who had cared for him through the years his mother had not called. There was, in the capital around this time, a telephone number you could call. 2 numbers, actually, for the same service. Both of them began with the exchange 250. The service was called Anti-SPID, and it was staffed around the clock by volunteer therapists. The therapists worked 12-hour shifts. The shifts began at 9 in the morning and at 9 at night. The line did not close. On the night shift, there were always at least 2 of them, 1 on each of the numbers. They answered the calls and they stayed on the phone as long as the callers wanted to stay on the phone. The founder of the service was a therapist named Sergei Trofimov. He was a tall, quiet man with a beard that was almost entirely gray. I met him at the office of the service, a single large room on the upper floor of a building near the hospital. 4 desks, 4 telephones, a kettle in the corner that was always on, a poster on the wall with the 2 phone numbers written in red marker on a piece of white paper, which was the only advertising they had. He talked to me for an hour about the calls. The calls, he said, fell into a few categories. The smallest category was the call from someone who actually had the disease. Those calls did come in. They were usually the shortest. People in that category often called once, said what they needed to say, asked a specific question, and hung up. They did not usually want to talk at length. They wanted information. They were making arrangements. The much larger category was the call from someone who was afraid they had the disease and did not have it. That was the category of most of the calls. Those calls could go on for hours. The record, he said, was over 8 hours. A man somewhere in the country who had begun his call around 9 at night and had ended it around 5 the next morning. He told me about a man who had called from Tbilisi. The man had said he had AIDS. He was certain of it. Trofimov had asked him how he knew. The man had said he had been with a woman of light behavior several months earlier, and ever since that night he had had diarrhea, almost every day. 5 months of it. Trofimov had listened for a while. He had asked some questions. He had gently suggested that what the man was describing was probably not the disease. What he was describing was probably chronic dysentery, which could be treated, and for which the man should see a doctor of a different kind. Trofimov had also suggested, because this was the second-order work of the service, that the man go in for an anonymous test to settle the question once and for all. The man had agreed. He had thanked Trofimov at length, with a voice that had become very tired. Trofimov told me that most of what the service did was not about the disease itself. Most of what the service did was treat a related condition, for which a word had appeared in Russian in the last year or 2. The word was the fear of the disease. The people who had it were not sick. They were afraid they were sick. They were afraid in ways that had begun to interfere with their lives. They could not sleep. They could not go to work. They had stopped sleeping with their spouses. They had disinfected the kitchen floor twice a day. They had, in some cases, stopped eating food they had not prepared themselves. The most memorable call he had taken recently had been from a mother. The mother had said she was afraid her daughter was going to infect her. The daughter was, by her mother's account, a prostitute. The daughter lived in the same apartment. The daughter brought home, from time to time, men she met in the lobbies of foreign hotels. The mother was terrified that the daughter was infected and would infect her and the younger son who also lived in the apartment. The mother had begun cleaning the bathroom, the sink, the tub, the toilet, with industrial bleach several times a day. Trofimov had explained, patiently, that the disease was not transmitted by dishes or towels or handshakes or toilet seats. He had explained this 3 times in different ways over the course of the call. The mother had thanked him and had said she would take it under consideration. He did not know when she hung up whether she had been persuaded. I asked Trofimov where he thought the fear was coming from. He thought about it for a while. He said several things. He said fear was an old thing that humans were good at. He said the virus was new and people had not yet found the shape of thinking that fit it. He said the press had not always been careful with what it published in the early years. He said that in his experience, the callers were often people who had been living with a general anxiety about any number of things for most of their lives, and that the virus had simply given that anxiety a name. But the main thing he said was about a document a year or so earlier. He said a set of methodological recommendations had been issued by the main Directorate of Maternal and Child Health at the Ministry of Health. The document was called HIV Infection in Children. It had been signed by 4 professors and 1 candidate of medical sciences. It had been circulated to hospitals across the country. The document had said, among other things, that saliva represented Trofimov quoted this from memory, with a small wry pause before the word, one of the greatest dangers of transmission. This was not true. Scientists had already established, by the time this document was written, that the virus was not, for practical purposes, transmitted through saliva. The document either did not know this or had chosen to ignore it. Which of those 2 things had happened? Trofimov said he did not know. The other notable thing the document had said was that children who were HIV positive should be hospitalized in conditions matching those used for, he quoted this also, patients with altered behavior in cases of central nervous system damage. In plain Russian, he said, this meant psychiatric wards. The document was recommending that sick children who had done nothing be placed in the kind of facility usually reserved for adults whose minds had ceased to function in the ordinary way. The association that ran the country's anti-AIDS work had decided, half as a joke, to issue an award for the greatest harm done to the fight against the disease in the preceding year. The joke award was a condom with a hole in it. They had given it, on paper, to the authors of the document. When they had gone to try to hand it over, a strange thing had happened. The 4 professors had been contacted. Each of them had categorically denied having authored the passages. Not one of them would put his hand up for either the saliva claim or the psychiatric ward claim. The candidate of sciences was contacted. He also denied authorship. The ministry official who had signed off on the document was contacted. He declined to comment, but in a way that made clear he did not consider himself the author either. The document existed. The document bore 5 names and a signature. The document had been sent to every maternal and child health directorate in every region of the country. The document was being used by pediatricians who were making decisions about what to do with sick children. But nobody had written it. Trofimov looked at me for a long moment when he told me this. He said, "This is where the calls come from, not only from this, but mostly from this. A mother hears secondhand that saliva transmits the disease. She cleans her bathroom with bleach. She is no longer eating at her mother-in-law's apartment. She has not kissed her husband in 3 weeks. And she is calling us at 1 in the morning to ask whether her daughter can infect her by sharing a spoon." I asked him what had been the hardest call he had taken this year. He thought about it for a while. He said it was not one he should repeat in detail. He said only that it was a woman who had been infected by her husband, who had been infected through a blood transfusion several years before. The woman had not been told about her husband's diagnosis until after she had been diagnosed herself. She had called not to ask about the disease. She had called to ask a question about her husband. He did not tell me what the question was. I did not ask. I walked back to the office in the slow light of the late afternoon. It was spring. The snow was going. The sidewalks were wet. A group of children in red school uniforms was walking home in a line. A woman was selling something from a little table at a corner. I thought about Reynolds's mother. I kept coming back to her. I wanted to know what she had said to herself. The first Sunday she did not answer. I wanted to know what she had said to herself on the 100th Sunday. I wanted to know what, if anything, she had felt, if she had heard the news, and they always hear eventually. Mothers, through whichever channel, that her son was still alive 4 years in, past the doctor's 18 months, lifting weights and giving speeches. I thought about whether she had picked up the phone then. I thought about whether it was by then too late, and in what sense it was too late, and whether the phrase had any meaning anymore. I thought about the nurse. She was, in her way, the most interesting case I had met that year. She had not joined the third epidemic herself. She had not turned away from her patients. She had gone to work every day and had treated them decently and had, I had seen with my own eyes, remembered their names and small details about their families. She was not a carrier of the cruelty. She was a person hiding from it. She was hiding from what she believed would happen in her own home if her husband knew what kind of patients she touched in the ward. She was not hiding from her patients. She was hiding from her husband. And she was doing this, I assumed, for the same reason that most people do most things like this. She did not want to lose him. She did not want their child to lose him. She did not want to be a single woman raising a child in this city on a nurse's salary. So she lied to her husband about what kind of ward she worked in. And she came home and she took off her shoes and she ate dinner with him, and she did not tell him what she had held that day. I assumed she loved him. I assumed he loved her. I assumed, too, that if the disease she was afraid of bringing home ever did reach him, he would be the first person to look at her differently. And I assumed she knew this. And I assumed that every evening across the table she knew this fresh and did not say it. That evening at the office, I pulled the cassette off the shelf. I looked at it for a while. It was a small plastic thing, black, with the brand name printed in red letters on the side. I put it back. I wrote, instead, a long letter to a friend I had at a medical journal. I asked her whether she had read the Man piece. I asked her if she had, what she thought about it. I asked her, specifically, whether she thought Man was right that the third epidemic was more dangerous than the first two. I did not write anything in the letter about the nurse, because I had promised not to. I mailed the letter the next morning on the way to work. She wrote back about 3 weeks later. She said she had read the piece. She said she agreed, mostly with Man's framework. She said she disagreed with the order of the numbers. The third epidemic was not third. It had begun before either of the others. The virus and the disease had only given it something to attach itself to. What Man had called the third, she wrote, was in fact the first. It had been running in the human population for as long as the human population had existed. It had run through other epidemics before this one. It would run through other epidemics after it was. If you wanted a name for it, the first epidemic of the species, the one the species never quite shook. I read her letter twice, and then I put it in the drawer with the notes. I sat at the desk for a while. I looked at the cassette on the shelf. I thought about taking it down again. I thought about sending it to the nurse by courier with a note, telling her that she could destroy it herself, or keep it, or do with it whatever she wished. In the end, I left it where it was. She had asked me not to have it. Sending it back to her would have been another way of having it, of making sure she knew I had remembered, of placing the film back in her hand, and with it the conversation. The kindest thing, I decided, was to let the small plastic object sit on the shelf and be forgotten. I went home. On the way, I stopped at a kiosk and bought a paper. There was nothing in the paper about any of this. There rarely was. The paper was full of other things. A harvest report, a hockey game, the obituary of a composer I had once liked. I went home and I put the paper on the kitchen table, and I did not open it. I stood by the window for a while looking at the courtyard. I thought about all the telephones in the city that had been disconnected at 9 o'clock tonight and would not be reconnected until 7 tomorrow morning. I thought about all the mothers across the country, just now, at just this hour, watching the phone not ring. I thought about the son in the other country who had stopped trying to get through somewhere. In one of those houses, I thought, there was still a phone that might be answered. Somewhere a mother was about to pick up. Somewhere a husband was about to learn the true name of the ward his wife worked in and was about to react, not by flinching, not by stepping back, but by doing what he had always done, which was to take her hand in his, somewhere in one of those houses. Just not, I thought, in the ones I had been writing about.